Picture this. You are standing on the ramparts of Homs. It is late December 1299. The air is biting cold, freezing the moisture in your beard, but sweat is running down your back. You aren't sweating because of the heat. You are sweating because the horizon is moving. For 40 years, your people, the Mamluks, have told themselves a comforting lie. You told yourselves the nightmares were over. You told yourselves the monsters from the east were broken forever at Ain Jalut. You believed the wall of heavy cavalry you built was impenetrable. But looking out at that grey wall of dust rising against the winter sky, you know the lie is dead. That isn't a storm. It is the Ilkhanate. 60,000 Mongols screaming for blood, returning to finish what Genghis started. The ground beneath your boots begins to tremble, a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration that you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. It is the sound of 100,000 hooves beating in unison, and this time they aren't just coming for land, they are coming to erase you. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Most history books will tell you the Mongol conquests ended in 1260. They will tell you the Golden Horde stopped expanding, the empire fractured, and the world took a breath. They are lying. The machine didn't stop. It just evolved. And the man leading this new apocalypse isn't a pagan god king worshipping the eternal blue sky. His name is Ghazan Khan. He speaks your language. He quotes your Quran. He calls himself a Muslim. But do not let the prayers fool you. Underneath the turban, he is still a wolf. He is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, and he has inherited every ounce of the family's talent for violence. But Ghazan is dangerous because he is different. He isn't just a warlord, he is an intellectual. He studies history, chemistry, and botany. He understands the science of war as well as the art of it. He has spent years reforming the Ilkhanate, turning a chaotic horde into a disciplined state. He has traded the chaotic raids for calculated campaigns. He knows that to break the Mamluks, he cannot just outfight them, he has to outthink them. Opposing him is the Mamluk Sultanate, the anomaly of history. These are men who were bought as boys, trained as killers in the barracks of Cairo, and freed to rule. They are the slave kings of Egypt. For decades, they have been the shield of the Muslim world. They stopped the Crusaders. They stopped the Mongols. They believe they are invincible because God wills it. But the lions of Egypt are old. The legendary generation that saved civilization, Baybars, Kalawun, is dead. In their place is a 19-year-old boy, Sultan An-Nasir Muhammad. He is brave, certainly. But bravery is cheap when you are staring down 60,000 battle-hardened veterans who have ridden across half the world to burn your palace. The Mamluk army marching to meet them is heavy, powerful, and arrogant. They are riding north into the Levant, expecting glory. They are expecting the Mongols to break against their heavy cavalry like waves against a rock. They do not realize that the tide has changed. They do not realize that Ghazan has not come to raid. He has come to conquer. He brings with him not just arrows, but a psychological terror that the Mamluks are not ready for. The enemy is no longer a barbarian at the gate. The enemy is a mirror image, a shadow that prays to your god while it sharpens its blade to cut your throat. The board is set in the hills north of Homs. The pieces are moving, and the trap is about to snap shut on the greatest army of the medieval age. This is the story of the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar, the day the immovable object finally cracked. To understand why the ground in Syria was about to be soaked in blood, you have to understand that this wasn't a normal war. Most wars in the Middle Ages were like business transactions. A king wants a castle, he brings an army, he besieges it, he makes a deal. Everyone goes home. This was not that. This was an existential cage match between the two deadliest military machines on the planet, and only one of them was going to walk out alive. On one side, you have the Ilkhanate. This isn't the Golden Horde raiding Russian villages for fun. This is a settled, wealthy, hyper-advanced Persian Mongol superpower. They have engineers, they have a bureaucracy, and they have a chip on their shoulder the size of the Himalayas. For 40 years, the Mamluks have been the only thing stopping them from dipping their horses' hooves in the Mediterranean. It drives them insane. To the Mongols, the Mamluks aren't just enemies, they are a glitch in the matrix. The Mongol worldview is simple. God gave us the world, so if you resist us, you are resisting God. But here is where the psychological horror kicks in. For the first time, the Mongols aren't coming as pagans. Ghazan Khan is a Muslim. His generals are Muslim. They carry the Quran in their saddlebags, and yet they are coming to burn Damascus just as eagerly as their grandfather Hulagu did. Imagine the confusion in the minds of the Syrian peasants. You look at the invaders, and they look like monsters, but they sound like brothers. They pray toward Mecca 5 times a day, and then they cut your head off. It breaks the narrative. The Mamluks can't call this a jihad against the infidel anymore. Now it is something much uglier. It is a civil war for the soul of the Islamic world. Ghazan claims the Mamluks are illegitimate, usurpers, slaves who stole a throne, sinners who drink wine and oppress the people. He is painting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He is gaslighting an entire civilization while marching an army of 60,000 men to crush it, and standing in his way is the Mamluk Sultanate. If the Mongols are the unstoppable force, the Mamluks are the immovable object. They are a military anomaly, a society where the only way to be a king is to have been a slave. They are imported from the Turkic steppes as children, brainwashed in the barracks of Cairo, and turned into the finest heavy cavalry the world has ever seen. They are the only soldiers on earth who can go toe-to-toe with a Mongol archer and win. They have heavier armor, bigger horses, and a discipline that makes Roman legions look like a rabble. They don't fear death because they have been dead to their old lives since they were boys. But in 1299, the Mamluk machine is rusting. The Sultan, An-Nasir Muhammad, is a teenager surrounded by sharks. His emirs are fighting each other for power, corruption is rampant, and they have grown complacent. They think the desert is a wall that will protect them. They think history is on their side. So when the scouts come riding into the camp screaming that the Mongols have crossed the Euphrates, it isn't just panic that sets in, it is cognitive dissonance. It shouldn't be happening. The Mamluks scramble to assemble. They pull the army together, Bedouin auxiliaries, heavy Mamluk knights, Syrian conscripts. They march north from Gaza, confident, arrogant, heavy with gold and steel. They are walking into a trap, not of geography, but of hubris. They believe they are fighting the same old war. They believe the Mongols will charge, shoot some arrows, get tired, and leave. They don't realize that Ghazan has studied them. He knows their armor is too heavy for a long chase. He knows their horses need more water than his. He knows their political unity is a fragile lie. The immovable object is cracked, and the unstoppable force knows exactly where to hit. As the two armies close the distance near the Wadi al-Khaznadar, the Mamluks are fighting for survival. The Mongols are fighting for a legacy, and the people of Syria, they are just waiting to see which version of the apocalypse is going to rule them tomorrow. When we think of the Mongols, we have a very specific image burned into our brains. We picture a swarm of wild, screaming nomads on ponies, wearing furs, drinking horse blood, and shooting arrows backward while riding away. That is the Genghis Khan starter pack. It's terrifying, it's effective, and by 1299, it was completely obsolete. If the Mamluks were expecting that version of the Mongols, they were preparing for a war that didn't exist anymore. The army Ghazan Khan brought to Syria wasn't a horde. It was a professional military superpower that had undergone a massive software update. Ghazan had looked at the humiliating defeats of the past, especially the disaster at Ain Jalut, and he realized a hard truth: the old ways were getting his people killed. The Mamluks had heavy armor, big horses, and tight formations. Plinking arrows at them from a distance was like throwing pebbles at a tank. It was annoying, but it wasn't lethal. So Ghazan did what any genius psychopath would do. He adapted. He initiated a military revolution that fundamentally changed how the Ilkhanate fought. He stopped relying entirely on the chaotic tribal levies and started building a standing army. He began distributing land grants, known as iktas, to his soldiers. This sounds like boring administrative paperwork, but it was a stroke of brilliance. By giving his soldiers land, he turned them from looters into stakeholders. They weren't just fighting for the next sack of gold, they were fighting for their paychecks, their estates, and their future. He professionalized the logistics, ensuring that the arrow you shot today would be replaced tomorrow. But the biggest change was physical. The Mongols at Wadi al-Khaznadar were heavier. They had adopted the armor of their enemies. They were wearing lamella steel, carrying heavier lances, and riding horses bred for impact, not just stamina. Ghazan had essentially created a hybrid monster, an army that had the strategic mobility of the steppes, but the tactical weight of a feudal kingdom. But the most dangerous weapon Ghazan handed his men wasn't a lance. It was moral superiority. This is where the story gets twisted. For decades, the Mongols were the scourge of God, the pagans sent to punish the faithful. But Ghazan flipped the script. By converting to Islam, he weaponized religion against the Mamluks. He told his troops that the Mamluks weren't real Muslims. They were slaves, usurpers, and tyrants who had forgotten the laws of God. He painted the invasion of Syria not as a conquest, but as a correction. He convinced his wolves that they were actually the sheepdogs. This is terrifying because there is no soldier more lethal than one who believes he's doing God's dirty work. The Mongols marching on Homs weren't just hungry for plunder. They were self-righteous. They looked at the Mamluks and didn't see equals. They saw frauds. So when the two armies finally spotted each other across the dusty plains, the Mamluks were looking at a mirror image that had been tweaked for maximum violence. They saw Mongol heavy cavalry that could stand and fight in close quarters. They saw a disciplined line of battle, not a swarming mob. Ghazan had taken the raw, feral energy of the steppe and focused it through the lens of Persian military science. He had built a machine designed for one specific purpose: to crack the heavy shell of the Mamluk Sultanate and eat the soft meat inside. The Mamluks, sitting on their high horses, were still fighting the ghosts of 1260. They didn't realize that the ghosts had learned how to use heavy artillery. If the Mongols were the revolutionary tech startup trying to disrupt the industry of warfare, the Mamluks were the old, established monopoly that thought it was too big to fail. To understand why they were so arrogant, you have to look at their resume. For 40 years, the Mamluk Sultanate had been the graveyard of crusades and the wall that broke the Mongol wave. They were the undisputed heavyweight champions of the medieval world, and they knew it. Their entire society was built on a paradox that sounds like fiction. To be a king, you first had to be a slave. The men sitting on those massive war horses weren't born into power. They were purchased. They were kidnapped as boys from the Kipchak steppes, sold in the slave markets of Cairo, and thrown into a military academy that was half monastery, half trauma factory. They were stripped of their families, their names, and their pasts. Their only family was their unit. Their only father was the Sultan. They were drilled in Furusiya, a martial art that combined horsemanship, archery, and lance combat into a dance of lethal precision. By the time a Mamluk graduated, he wasn't a human being anymore. He was a biological weapon. He was heavier than a European knight and more disciplined than a Spartan. When the Mamluks charged, they didn't just break enemy lines, they pulverized them. This system had produced legends like Baybars and Kalawun, men who drank Mongol tears for breakfast. But by 1299, the factory was producing defective goods. The discipline was slipping. The band of brothers mentality had dissolved into political infighting. The emirs were too busy stabbing each other in the back for promotions to notice that the world outside was changing. Leading this dysfunction was Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad. He was barely out of puberty. He was the son of the great Kalawun, living in the shadow of a giant. He desperately needed a win. He didn't just want to defeat the Mongols, he wanted to humiliate them. He wanted his own Ain Jalut. He wanted to prove that the blood of the lion ran in his veins. So when the reports came in that Ghazan was approaching, the Sultan didn't play it safe. He didn't use the scorched earth tactics that had worked in the past. He didn't harass the Mongol supply lines. He gathered his army and marched straight into the open, chest puffed out, daring the Mongols to hit him. The Mamluk strategy was simple because it had always worked. They assumed the Mongols would be the same light cavalry they had always been, fast, annoying, but fragile. The plan was to weather the arrow storm with their superior armor, wait for the Mongols to get close, and then unleash a heavy cavalry charge that would shatter the lighter enemy like glass. It was a solid plan. It was a proven plan. The only problem was that it was a plan designed to fight the Mongols of 1260, not the Mongols of 1299. The Mamluks looked across the Wadi al-Khaznadar and saw a mirror image of their own arrogance. They didn't see the heavy armor on the Mongol horses. They didn't see the discipline in the Mongol lines. They saw a prey animal that had forgotten its place. The Mamluks tightened their girths, lowered their visors, and prepared to teach the barbarians a lesson. They didn't realize that they were the ones about to go to school. The date is December 22nd, 1299. It is early afternoon. The sun is hanging low in the winter sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. The waiting is over. The diplomatic shouting matches are done. The prayers are finished. Now the only thing left is physics. The Mamluk army initiates the charge. If you have never stood in front of a heavy cavalry charge, you cannot understand the terror of it. It is not just horses running, it is a geological event. Imagine 25,000 armored men and beasts, a wave of steel and muscle moving at 30 miles per hour, focused on a single point. The ground doesn't just shake, it liquefies. The Mamluks believe this is the end of the battle. They expect the Mongols to do what they always do, panic, turn their ponies around, and scatter like roaches when the lights turn on. They expect to chase them down and butcher them from behind. But as the Mamluk line smashes into the Ilkhanate formation, something impossible happens. The Mongols do not run, they do not scatter, they absorb the impact. Ghazan Khan has trained his men to dismount and form a shield wall, locking their heavy Pavis shields together to create a fortress of wood and iron in the middle of the open field. The Mamluk charge hits that wall with the force of a freight train, and the sound of the collision is deafening. It isn't the clean clang of swords you hear in movies. It is the sickening wet crunch of thousands of horses breaking their necks. It is the sound of steel plates buckling under pressure and men being crushed inside their own armor. The front line of the Mamluk army is instantly vaporized by the sudden stop, piling up in a grotesque mountain of broken limbs and thrashing animals. For the Mamluks behind them, the world dissolves into chaos. The dust kicked up by 80,000 horses blots out the sun, turning the afternoon into a choking, grey twilight. You can't see the flags, you can't hear the trumpets. You are fighting in a closet with a chainsaw. And in this blindness, the numbers game begins to take its toll. The Mamluks are elite, yes. Man for man, they are better fighters. But they are outnumbered 3-1. For every Mongol they kill, 3 more step over the corpse to take his place. The Mongols are swarming over the stalled cavalry like army ants taking down a tarantula. They are pulling the Mamluks off their horses with hooked lances, dragging them into the mud where their heavy armor becomes a coffin. A Mamluk knight on a horse is a god of war. A Mamluk knight on his back in the mud is just a turtle waiting to be cracked open, and the Mongols are cracking them open with terrifying efficiency. They are using maces and axes, weapons designed to smash through helmets and crush skulls. The invincible heavy cavalry is being dismantled piece by piece. The psychological shock is worse than the physical one. The Mamluks are realizing in real time that the legends are wrong. The enemy isn't afraid of them. The enemy is better equipped than they are. And the enemy is closing in from the wings, wrapping around the Mamluk flanks like a suffocating blanket. The center is holding through sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness, but the edges are fraying. The screams of the dying are drowning out the orders of the officers. The slaughter at Wadi al-Khaznadar has begun, and the Mamluks are finding out that bravery is no substitute for math. Panic is a contagion. It is a biological virus that jumps from man to man faster than the plague. It usually starts with a single soldier. Maybe he sees his captain get decapitated by a Mongol mace. Maybe he realizes his sword has snapped in half. Maybe he just looks at the ocean of enemies surrounding him and realizes that the math doesn't work. He takes a step back, then he turns, then he runs. And when the man next to him sees that, he runs too. At Wadi al-Khaznadar, the infection started on the Mamluk right flank. This was the section held by the Bedouin auxiliaries and the Syrian conscripts. These men were brave, but they were not the ironclad terminators of the Royal Mamluk Corps. They were lighter, softer, and they were being hammered by the heaviest concentration of Mongol cavalry. The Mongol pressure on that flank was relentless. It wasn't just a fight, it was a hydraulic press. The Bedouins were pushed back step by bloody step until their formation snapped. And once that line broke, the floodgates opened. 10,000 Mongol horsemen poured into the gap like water rushing into a sinking ship. Suddenly, the elite Mamluk center, the heavy hitters who were still holding their ground, found themselves fighting a war on 3 sides. They were being attacked from the front, flanked from the right, and shot in the back. The structure of the army disintegrated. What was once a disciplined grid of regiments turned into a confused, swirling mob of individuals trying to stay alive for one more minute. In the center of this collapsing nightmare sat Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad. Remember, he is 19 years old. He came here to be Alexander the Great. He came here to write his name in the stars. Instead, he is watching his entire world burn down around him. Historical chronicles tell us he was weeping, not tears of sadness, but tears of rage and humiliation. He wanted to charge. He wanted to die a martyr. But his emirs, the old wolves who had survived decades of court intrigue, grabbed his horse's bridle. They knew the battle was over. They knew that a dead sultan meant a civil war back in Cairo. They had to make the hardest decision in warfare, to cut their losses and run. The order to retreat was never officially given because no trumpet could be heard over the screaming. It was a visual signal. The Sultan's banner turned south, and when the army saw their king leaving, the last shreds of discipline evaporated. The retreat wasn't a tactical withdrawal, it was a scramble for the exits. Men threw away their shields to run faster. They abandoned their baggage train, their gold and their wounded. To be left behind was a death sentence. The Mongols weren't taking prisoners, they were taking heads. As the Mamluks fled toward Homs, the road became a slaughterhouse. The Mongols pursued them with the terrifying energy of predators who smell blood. They cut down the stragglers, rode over the fallen, and turned the path of retreat into a carpet of corpses. The invincible Mamluk army, the saviors of Islam, had been broken in a single afternoon. They had walked onto the field as lions and were leaving as gazelles. If the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar was a tragedy, what happened next was a horror movie. With the Mamluk army fleeing back to Egypt, Syria was left naked. There was no shield, no wall, and no army standing between the Mongols and the civilians. The road to Damascus was wide open, and you have to understand what Damascus was. It wasn't just a city, it was the jewel of the Islamic world. It was a center of culture, wealth, and religion. And on December 30th, 1299, the people of Damascus looked over their walls and saw the apocalypse parking its horse on their front lawn. But here is the twist. Ghazan Khan didn't order an immediate sack. He didn't burn the city down instantly like his ancestors would have. He played a different game. He offered them a deal. He issued a proclamation guaranteeing the safety of the city, the protection of the mosques and the lives of the citizens in exchange for tribute. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? It sounds civilized. It was a lie. It was a protection racket on a geopolitical scale. The notables of Damascus opened the gates thinking they could buy their survival. They thought they were dealing with a fellow Muslim ruler. They were wrong. They were letting a vampire into the house because he promised not to bite them. Once the Mongols were inside, the mask slipped. The tribute wasn't a one-time payment. It was a systematic stripping of the city's bones. First, they took the gold from the treasury. Then, they demanded the gold from the merchants. Then they went house to house. If you didn't have gold, they took your furniture. If you didn't have furniture, they took your clothes. The markets of Damascus, usually filled with silk and spices, were turned into interrogation centers. The price of food skyrocketed so high that people were selling their children just to buy bread. The streets were filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and the smoke of burning archives. And while the city was being bled dry, the Mongols committed the ultimate blasphemy. They stabled their horses in the courtyards of the mosques. Imagine the psychological violation. You are a citizen of Damascus, starving, freezing in the Syrian winter, watching your Muslim liberators drinking wine and gambling on the holy floors of the Umayyad Mosque. It was a display of dominance designed to break the spirit of the population. They weren't just taking your money, they were showing you that your God couldn't stop them. However, amidst this degradation, there was one tiny island of defiance, the citadel of Damascus. While the city surrendered, the commander of the citadel, a man named Arjawash, locked the gates and refused to bow. He looked at Ghazan Khan and essentially said, "Come and get me." The Mongols surrounded the fortress. They pounded it with siege engines. They unleashed a storm of arrows, but the citadel held. It became a symbol of the resistance that the Mamluk army had failed to provide. Every day the flag flew over the citadel was a reminder to Ghazan that his victory was incomplete. But for the civilians trapped in the city below, looking up at that fortress was torture. It was so close, yet so helpless to save them from the nightmare unfolding in their living rooms. Damascus wasn't destroyed in a day. It was digested slowly over weeks of cold, calculated cruelty. Here is the boring, unsexy truth about medieval warfare that movies never show you. You can have the best general, the sharpest swords, and the favor of God, but if your horses don't eat, your empire dies. Ghazan Khan had conquered Syria. He was sitting on the throne of Damascus. He had humiliated the Mamluks, but as January 1300 rolled around, he realized he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. The problem wasn't the Mamluks, the problem was biology. The Mongol army was a logistical nightmare. Every Mongol soldier rode with a string of 3 to 4 horses. This gave them incredible mobility, but it also meant that Ghazan wasn't just feeding 60,000 men. He was feeding nearly 250,000 animals. In the lush grasslands of the steppes, this works. In the rocky, arid hills of Syria in the middle of winter, it is suicide. The grass was dead. The granaries had been looted or burned. The Mamluks, even in their retreat, had practiced a scorched earth policy, destroying fodder supplies to ensure that the conquerors inherited a wasteland. Ghazan's army began to starve. You can discipline a man to ration his food. You can tell him to tighten his belt for the glory of the Khan. You cannot explain geopolitics to a horse. When horses get hungry, they get weak. When they get weak, they die. And a Mongol without a horse is just a short man with funny pants standing in the mud. The invincible army was dissolving, not because of enemy arrows, but because of the caloric deficit. To make matters worse, the Mamluks hadn't actually disappeared. They had just changed shape. The organized army was gone, but the resistance remained. Bedouin tribes, loyal to the Mamluks, or just loyal to chaos, began swarming the supply lines. They were the ghosts in the fog. They would ambush foraging parties, slit a few throats and vanish back into the desert before the heavy cavalry could saddle up. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The Mongols controlled the ground they stood on, but if they took 5 steps outside the city walls, they were prey. Then came general winter. The weather in 1300 was brutal. Heavy rains turned the roads into swamps. Cold snaps froze men to death in their saddles. The Mongols were tough, but they were miserable. The psychological high of the victory at Wadi al-Khaznadar was wearing off, replaced by the damp, cold reality of occupation. Ghazan looked at his spreadsheets, or whatever the medieval equivalent was, and realized the math didn't work. He had won the battle, but he was losing the campaign. If he stayed, his army would starve to death by spring. So in February 1300, the man who had crushed the Mamluk Sultanate did the unthinkable. He packed his bags. He announced that he was returning to Persia to rest his horses and promised to return in the winter to finish the job. It was a humiliating anticlimax. The storm that had threatened to swallow the Islamic world simply ran out of gas. Ghazan left a small garrison behind to hold the conquests, but everyone knew what that meant. As soon as the main Mongol army crossed back over the Euphrates, the vultures would circle. The logistics of doom had done what the Mamluk heavy cavalry couldn't. It forced the Mongols to retreat. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does war. The moment the last Mongol tail disappeared over the horizon in February 1300, the vacuum in Syria began to fill. But it didn't fill with hope. It filled with vengeance. The Mamluks, who had been licking their wounds in Egypt, didn't wait for an invitation to return. They poured back into the Levant like a rising tide. And this time, they weren't looking for glory. They were looking for names. You have to imagine the terror of the collaborators in Damascus. For 3 months, you bowed to Ghazan Khan. You paid him tribute. You named him in your Friday prayers because you thought the Mamluks were finished. You thought the old order was dead, but now the Mongols are gone, and the Mamluk emirs are riding back through the gates, checking their lists of who was loyal and who was practical. The liberation of Syria was less of a parade and more of a purge. The Mamluks needed to reassert dominance, and in the medieval world you don't do that with speeches, you do it with executions. They re-established control over Homs, Aleppo and Damascus with brutal speed. But amidst the reprisals, something fundamental had changed in the Mamluk psyche. The defeat at Wadi al-Khaznadar should have broken them. By all historical precedents, an army that gets crushed like that collapses, the government falls, the dynasty ends. But the Mamluks didn't collapse. They absorbed the blow. They realized that while they had lost the battle, they were winning the war of attrition. They realized that the Mongols had a fatal flaw. The Ilkhanate was a beast that needed too much food. It was a shark that died if it stopped moving. The Mamluks realized they didn't need to defeat the Mongols in a pitched battle to win. They just needed to survive them. They needed to be the cockroach, not the lion. This realization was the turning of the tide. The aura of Mongol invincibility, which had been cracked at Ain Jalut, was now completely shattered. Yes, Ghazan had won at Kili. He had outgeneraled them, he had outfought them. But what did he have to show for it? Nothing. He held the ground for 3 months, and then was forced to retreat by grass and mud. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For 40 years, the Muslim world lived in fear that the Mongols were a punishment from God, an unstoppable force of nature. Kili proved that they weren't nature, they were just men. They froze in the winter, their horses starved, they made logistical errors. The Mamluks stopped fearing the boogeyman and started analyzing him. They began to rebuild their army, not with the arrogance of 1299, but with the cold, hard pragmatism of survivors. They adopted better armor, they drilled harder, they prepared for the next round. Ghazan Khan would try again. He was obsessed with Syria. It was his white whale, but the window of opportunity had slammed shut. The Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar was the high watermark of the Mongol expansion in the Middle East. It was the moment the wave crashed highest up the beach, destroyed the sandcastle, and then receded. The water would never get that high again. The Mamluks retook their cities, rebuilt their walls, and waited. They knew the Mongols would return, but they also knew that the next time the outcome would be different. The ghosts of Kili were screaming for payback, and the Mamluks were ready to collect. The defeat that should have ended them had only made them meaner, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. History loves a winner. We build statues for the conquerors. We write songs about the triumphs. We remember the names of the generals who stood tall on the pile of corpses. But the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar forces us to look at something uncomfortable, the value of a catastrophic defeat. On paper, December 22nd, 1299, was a disaster for the Mamluks. They were outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and butchered. They lost the Levant, they lost their reputation, they lost thousands of their best men, but in the grand calculus of history, they won the only thing that actually matters. They survived. The legacy of Kili isn't the Mongol victory, it is the Mongol failure to capitalize on it. Ghazan Khan had the world in the palm of his hand. He had broken the one wall standing between him and total domination of the Islamic West, but he couldn't close his hand. He was defeated by the grass, the rain, and the sheer biological reality of his own war machine. The invincible wolves turned out to be mortal. They turned out to be subject to the laws of physics just like everyone else. And once that illusion was shattered, it could never be rebuilt. 3 years later, in 1303, the Mongols returned for one last try at the Battle of Marj al-Safar. But this time, the Mamluks didn't panic. They didn't charge blindly. They fought with the cold, calculated discipline of men who had seen the worst and lived to tell about it. They crushed the Ilkhanate army so thoroughly that the Mongols never returned to Syria again. The nightmare that had started with Genghis Khan finally ended, not with a bang, but with a Mamluk sword in the mud of a suffocating valley. Ghazan Khan died shortly after, some say of a broken heart, destroyed by the realization that his life's work had amounted to nothing more than a temporary raid. So the next time you feel like you have hit rock bottom, remember the Mamluks at Kili. Remember that a defeat isn't the end of the story unless you let it be. Sometimes getting your teeth kicked in is the necessary tuition you pay for the victory that comes later. The Mamluks ruled for another 200 years, guardians of a civilization that the Mongols tried to burn. They proved that it doesn't matter how hard you get hit. It matters whether you have the logistics, the will, and the spite to get back up. If you found value in this deep dive into the brutal resilience of the Mamluk Sultanate, please destroy that like button and subscribe. We are building a library of history's most incredible, forgotten moments, and I want you to be part of it. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think Ghazan Khan's conversion to Islam was a genuine spiritual awakening? Or was it just a cynical psychological weapon to destabilize his enemies? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your take. For those who want to see what happened when the Mamluks finally met their match against a different kind of monster, click this video here to learn about the rise of the Ottomans. Or if you want to dive deeper into the dark history of the Mongol psychology, click here. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about who we are today.